What is among Venezuela's closest allies? Iran. How is the Iranian regime able to pay its security services and military? The oil revenue. How is Venezuela's Maduro regime of thugs and imbeciles? How are they able to pay their bills and continue to steal from the people and oppress Venezuela, man, it was like, you talk to people. I haven't been, obviously, because it's been a mess for the last 15 years or so. But it was a beautiful place with tremendous natural resources and great people. And it has been ruined by socialist idiocy. Energy is one of the weak points of the Biden regime. There's no question about that. Energy policy, fossil fuels, they have an ideological obsession with limiting and pushing back as much as possible fossil fuel development in favor of renewables, even when they're more expensive, even when it has massive geopolitical implications. I mean, look at how the Russian economy has collapsed. Oh, wait, no, it hasn't. But that was what was going to happen, right? When we started, but we actually can't stop them from selling their oil. And that's hasn't even been shut down by the sanctions. Venezuela, though, is a country that the left does not want to talk to you about very much. I spent a lot of time in Florida, and South Florida in particular, in Clay. The Venezuelan refugee population in the United States is very, very considerable, very large, especially in South Florida. And Venezuela you've had about 6 million people in the last decade fleeing Venezuela. You have 6 million people who just couldn't deal with it anymore. They've seen every aspect of life in Venezuela, economically, socially, politically. There's not enough food on the shelves. The economy is destroyed. Hyperinflation is happening. All this has been going on. And it's because you have the Maduro socialist regime of thugs who are very quick to talk about social justice and redistribution of wealth. They've destroyed what was the second wealthiest country in South America. Yes, I believe the second wealthiest country. And even per capita, when you add in the oil revenues, it was a place that was doing quite well up through the 90s. But then the socialists took over. This is interesting because you have the Biden administration right before Thanksgiving cutting back on the sanctions that we have on Venezuela. And we could do a whole deep dive into, you have the Venezuelan, some of the top government officials are actually officially sanctioned as narco traffickers. To give you a sense of how things are going there, I think the vice president of Venezuela, he certainly was at one point a sanctioned narco trafficker by the U.S. Treasury Department. These are people that are making millions, perhaps even billions over the long haul, selling cocaine, heroin into the U.S., poisoning our cities and our people. The Biden administration decided that they were going to take more oil from Venezuela. And what's fascinating, they did this right before Thanksgiving, so nobody would pay attention. There's also a country right next to Venezuela, Guyana. My sister's husband's family is from Guyana. And Guyana just had the discovery of a considerable, I think it's 11 billion barrels, they estimate, offshore. So this is a huge boon, a huge economic game changer for the country of Guyana, which is a U.S. ally, aligned with us ideologically, capitalist in its approach. And at the same time, the Biden administration saying more oil from Venezuela, that sounds good. They vetoed a loan that the U.S. government was in a position through a public-private, one of these public-private vehicles, to make so that Guyana can't develop its offshore reserves. So we'd rather buy oil right now from the evil commies running Venezuela than help an ally in Guyana develop considerable resources, natural fossil fuel resources over the next 10 years. Because, Clay, why? The Green New Deal. And also, yes, the Biden regime likes commies. Let's be honest.
They totally slid this under the radar. Look, they begged Saudi Arabia to increase oil production, and Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman in particular, basically gave them the back of the hand. Remember, Biden traveled all the way to Saudi Arabia. They didn't want to shake hands, so instead he did a fist bump. And they also kind of slid late at night the story, by the way, after saying, oh, they're a pariah state. We're not going to treat Saudi Arabia well in the wake of the Jamal Khashoggi murder. They then said, oh, yeah, Mohammed bin Salman, he has diplomatic immunity, which feels to me like, Buck, even more of an attempt to try to get oil out of Saudi Arabia. And so, given what's going on with Russia, they have made the calculated decision. We are not going to increase production in the United States because we don't want to upset all these crazy environmentalist Green New Deal people. But instead, we're going to allow Venezuela to increase its production, and we're going to give more money to them instead of putting more money into our own country's coffers. So this is just infuriating because it presumes, first of all, that somehow the economy, the overall environment is better off because we're getting oil from those places as opposed to the United States, when in reality, Buck, it's actually worse for the environment because they don't have the same safeguards for oil and gas pumping that we do here. And most in the media just totally don't pay attention to it. And as you mentioned, they drop the news right in going into a holiday weekend, know that most people are not going to focus on it, and it just completely vanishes. It's, to me, emblematic of how broken American energy policy is under the Biden administration. But I think it's significant. I think it needs to be talked about. And it is just so transparently wrong.
You don't have to go that far back to read editorials in places like the New York Times that were really optimistic and very defensive even of Chavez. And now obviously it's the Maduro regime took over for Chavez. Because this had all the makings of the usual social justice narrative. Oh, there's the rich elites, and they have access to the oil wealth. And if only we had a government that was more considerate about sharing the wealth and spreading it around, they'll lift everybody out of poverty. And what they did is they nationalized a lot of assets. They seized the factories. They seized, obviously, the oil assets first, a socialist regime. They effectively destroyed private property and also started instituting price controls. And the price controls mechanism is what really drives things into the dumpster, because they say, oh, well, we can't get washing machines made, or you can't find any washing machines in the store. You can't name any consumer good. We're just going to set the price lower. Well, that creates a death spiral in the markets that creates massive shortages. It is an economic case study in why you don't actually have people who are so concerned with ending poverty and social justice making determinations about capital flows, making determinations about supply and demand, because they ruined this country. And I mean, I actually have some friends who are Venezuelan in the Miami area, and you talk to them and they say, why doesn't our crisis ever? I mean, obviously the Cubans in the Miami area have been living this situation for many decades now, but 6 million people had to flee Venezuela, many of them just with the clothing on their backs, because of what has been done in that country and because of idiotic policy decisions, both internally and externally. I just feel like there's a much bigger story here, but we'd rather get the oil from the evil Maduro regime than help Guyana with its 11 billion. The only country in the world, Clay, per capita that they think has more oil than Guyana is Kuwait, just to give everyone a sense of it. That's what a massive find it is, but it'll take some time, and that'll be a big new source of nearby secure energy for the global market, for the U.S. market. They don't want it. They'd rather make the evil dictators in Venezuela rich than actually have a capitalist ally with a longer-term horizon of fossil fuel production, because they're crazy. I don't know what else to, because they think the earth is going to melt and, we're going to be under sea and the polar bears are. Remember when the polar bears were all going to drown with Al Gore? That now when you talk to people, we have people live in Anchorage listening to us right now. Polar bears are everywhere. They're like squirrels.
The other aspect of this, Buck, that is so important, and you're talking about it from South Florida, Venezuelans are overwhelmingly Republican voters now.
I love it.
Because they, more than anybody else, you have all these Americans who are on the left in this country saying, no, you just don't really understand what socialism is. And the Venezuelans say, actually, that's why we're here. We've seen what happens when a country goes to socialism, because to your point, Venezuela was a very wealthy country. They were doing fantastically well in the Latin American overall economic rankings. And now the other thing about the inflation, Buck, is it's been so bad that as soon as you get any money, you feel like you need to run out and spend it because the next day the value is going to be so diminished. You kind of get into that inflation death spiral where you feel compelled to get as much value for your money as you can, which means you have to spend it immediately because whatever you're going to try to buy is going to cost more the next day or the day after. So the last thing you want to be doing is sitting around with that money as it continues to depreciate based on collapsing inflation.
And what is among Venezuela's closest allies? Iran. How is the Iranian regime able to pay its security services and military? The oil revenue. How is Venezuela's Maduro regime of thugs and imbeciles? How are they able to pay their bills and continue to steal from the people and oppress Venezuela, man, was like, you talk to people. I haven't been, obviously, because it's been a mess for the last 15 years or so. But it was a beautiful place with tremendous natural resources and great people. And it has been ruined by socialist idiocy. And if you were to ask most kids these days who think they're really politically active and savvy, college, high school, you name it, they have no idea what is going on in that country because ultimately there's a sensitivity about it. The Biden administration, there are two things that collide in the Venezuela story that mean that the regime, our regime, doesn't want us to know the truth. The fossil fuel climate change narrative, but then also the socialism and social justice component. So it never really gets attention. Cuba has been ruined by these things. Venezuela has been ruined by these things. And the Iranian regime, the Venezuelan regime, the Russians, the best thing we can do to deal with those opposition governments, perhaps even enemy governments, is to drill, baby, drill. Get as much domestic U.S. energy production as possible. Depress the global price of oil and energy. Beat them in the marketplace with our much more efficient production. By letting the price of gas run up, you keep Maduro, Putin, the mullahs, you keep them in charge.
And that used to be actually something that people agreed on, Buck. And then the Green New Deal and the AOCs of the world and the environmentalists totally took control of the Democrat Party. And as a result, we're now having to just give tens of billions of dollars of what would otherwise be United States money to these petro dictatorships beyond a shadow of a doubt.